Hi, I'm Stephanie Perotti. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to talk a little bit about product sales. Just to give you some background on me, I've worked with some amazing companies ranging from Universal Music to working with Jonathan and Drew Scott from Property Brothers to working with Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. In all of that, there was a large component of sales, marketing, and licensing. And what we're going to talk a little bit about today are the fundamentals. Although things have changed throughout the years, these are some tips that will help you get started no matter what type of product you're selling. So we want to start with a few assumptions about you and your business. So what are you doing now? So we're assuming going into this that you've had samples made, you have manufacturing lined up, whether that's on demand, small batch, could be domestic, could be imported. It's just very important that you understand your cost of goods going into this process because that's very important when you're determining your pricing. And we're assuming you have a social presence established and that your website is live. So once you have all of those things lined up, you're almost ready to go. So let's talk a little bit about managing risk. So we want to make sure you're not dumping too much money into your company at the outset without having any secured sales. So we want to make sure that you are well aware of what your inventory on hand needs to be to fulfill orders, and if you're having something made to order, how long it's going to take to actually receive those goods. That way you have a smooth process in your selling cycles. We want to make sure that you can ship samples if you need to. If you're not shipping physical samples, you have a way to replicate that experience in a meaningful way so a buyer would have an understanding of what it is that they're going to purchase. Returns, we want to know how we're going to process returns. If you're going to take returns, that's an important thing to distinguish. And we need to know what chargebacks are. So not all retailers have chargebacks. Some of them make a lot of money off of chargebacks. So basically what's happening here is if your merchandise has been taken on by a retailer and it's not sold and it's marked down, the brunt of the burden of that is going to fall on you. So you need to understand that. And you need to understand what happens if you ship late. Chargebacks could occur because of that as well. And you also need to understand what your overhead is and understanding how you need to build that into your price structure. So let's talk about some selling options. You can sell direct to consumer. That's called B2C, you being the B in that scenario. And then you can sell alternatively or supplementally business to business, so selling to a retailer that's going to then resell to a consumer. So B2C selling options, that's DTC is direct to consumer, so you'll hear that quite a bit when you're talking about selling. So the key challenge is creating demand. So important, no matter how you sell, you have to understand that you have to focus on demand creation. You can't rely solely on a retailer to do that. You have to think through the marketing side, and that's not for everyone. Some people like to just be creative and like to make things, but before you put it out in the world, you need to have a plan for creating demand for those products. That's going to make it more attractive to a retailer as well. You also need to understand drop shipping and EDI. EDI is electronic data, and that is all about exchanging information with a retailer about orders, about fulfillment. So it's important that you understand that if you're dealing with an e-commerce retailer. So your website. If you're just starting in e-commerce, I would highly suggest looking at Squarespace and Shopify. There are a ton of options out there. Those two, I think, are the most user-friendly. And you have to understand the challenges of managing your inventory, having pricing, versus what you would price it at a retailer. So you don't want to compete with the retailers that you're selling to if you're selling direct to consumer and selling through a retailer. Generally, what you'll find is that the brand sells their product for a slightly higher price than they would on a retailer site. That makes it more appealing to the retailer to pick up that product. So you don't want to poach your own sales through a retailer. And you need to understand also minimum advertised price. And this is really important with Amazon, as is the pricing, because Amazon will not allow you to sell your product for a price that's less than what Amazon is charging. That's really important to understand before you dive into the Amazon world. So Some challenges with some retailers that you may think about using. So with Etsy, you're dealing with rankings and returns. How are you going to process returns if you sell something through Etsy? That's really important. And making sure your page is search engine optimized and that you have a product ranking that's reasonably high when people are searching for a product in the category that you create. Amazon, you're going to deal with rankings, same issue. You want to make sure your keywords are all there. There's also a lot of fees involved with Amazon, and different products fall in different categories that have different fees related to them. So depending on what you're selling, you're going to pay a different percentage per product category. There's not a blanket fee associated with Amazon, so you have to know the nuances of that. You need to understand how advertising within the Amazon system affects your rankings, and you need to make sure that you have a good grasp on your inventory. Also, again, how you're going to process returns and what minimum advertised pricing is, and understand how the Amazon platform works in that regard. Something to think about if you're looking at selling direct-to-consumer through offline consumer events. This could be at a festival, it could be in a co-op situation, something like that. You need to think about your booth costs. You need to think about staffing. If you're flying solo and you're a sole proprietor and you want to go have an event and have a booth, you have to make sure you have some backup there and make sure that if you're paying that person, you're building all of these expenses into your pricing. Developing marketing collateral. What are people going to take away with them if they come visit your booth and they don't buy something, or if they do buy something? What is it that they're taking with your brand on it to get them to engage with you after they leave? And then again, how much inventory do you actually need for that event? So something else to think about is social commerce. Instagram has become quite a powerhouse for selling direct to consumer. So if you haven't spent a lot of time thinking about Instagram, I would strongly suggest that you do that. Again, you're looking at fees, so you need to understand what the fees are and what inventory needs you have to be selling on that platform. Some quick facts about selling on Instagram are here, but basically we're saying that Instagram is a large marketplace. There are a lot of consumers engaging with it, so your audience is probably already there. So if you can sell your product directly to them through that platform, then it's definitely worth considering. So there are other options if you're selling to a retailer, such as virtual showrooms. So there used to just be the method of going to a trade show, showing your wares, hoping you got an order there, and sending the order to the retailer. Retailer then sells it to the consumer. There's another scenario, and this is specific to fashion, but there are virtual e-commerce marketplaces where buyers can go, especially important now in the middle of a pandemic that we can't go to trade shows and we can't do all the brand engagement things that we used to do, so we have to find new ways to do that. So there are industry-specific e-commerce marketplaces where you can go and have your brand represented in a virtual environment. So something else to think about if you're thinking about selling to a retailer or you have a specific retailer in mind. You can do it yourself. You can try to get your foot in the door and go find the right buyer, or you can find a sales rep that has an existing relationship with that particular retailer, or a series of retailers that you're interested in, or a particular territory that you want to be in. So you have to understand that you're going to pay commission to those folks, but you're also sharing expenses with other brands. So you're getting a little more bang for your buck with marketing, but you're not going to be front and center. You're sharing that in kind of a co-op situation. So a physical showroom, a trade show booth, travel, these are all things that you might have additional expenses for with that sales rep. So you also want to know if you, again, if you're looking for a specific retail presence, you want to find a sales rep that has an existing relationship with that retailer. So that makes it worth the commission that you would potentially pay them. And there are retailer-specific sales groups. You just need to do a little research online to find that specific retail and retailer and what group deals with them specifically. And there's territory-specific ones too. So you may have 5 different sales reps that cover 5 different territories, each of them having specific needs. But you would again, be paying a commission to each one of them. So something else to consider, and this dives a little bit into the world of licensing, which is another subject, which there's another workshop on. So there's a private label situation in which your brand would be licensed to a retailer brand, and from a consumer side, it looks like a collaboration. So this requires some element of exclusivity from you. A retailer is not going to give you a private label deal if you have product in a competing retailer. So this requires inventory and marketing commitment from the retailer. So you wouldn't want to give up exclusivity at a retailer unless they're really willing to get behind it in a meaningful way. So just a some notes about licensing. Again, there's another workshop on this if you want to dive into that a little bit more. So the licensor is the IP owner, and that would be you if you were making your product. The licensee is the manufacturer or retailer. So that's the person who's either making the product or retailing the product to consumers. So DTR, again, is direct to retail, and the traditional licensing relationship is a licensor working with the manufacturer. But there are situations in which the licensor, the brand owner, would work with a retailer who then secures the manufacturing from their existing manufacturing vendors. So it's important to understand here who owns the brand. So if you're giving up the rights to your brand, that's something you need to be mindful of when you're entering into these deals, that you're not giving up too much control of your brand. And something else to be aware of is a diffusion brand. So understanding what that is. So we want to make sure, it's also called a bridge line. So Vera Wang is not known primarily for her line at Kohl's, but her higher priced items came first. And it's important that that's understood, because it's easier to start a diffusion brand after you have a major brand and then create a lower price point brand that's more accessible. So Simply Vera by Vera Wang at Kohl's is a good example of that. So understanding active involvement versus what we call label slapping. So that would be a passive situation in which you're just lending your brand and you're not actively involved in product development. You're just letting the retailer do what they want to do, and you're just basically lending your name to it. So let's talk about making the sale. So we want to talk a little bit about demand generation, tools and terms, working with buyers, and we'll talk a little bit about trade shows, which have changed a lot in the last year. So making the sale, demand generation is important. So what are you doing to generate demand? This is what retail buyers are going to want to know. If you're just hoping that they take the brunt of that work, that's not going to be very appealing to them. They need to know that your brand is relevant and that you're actively engaging with the audience to create demand for a product before they would pull it in. Also looking at the DIY competitive landscape analysis. So go in there and do some research before you meet with the buyer. That's really important to understand what the competitive landscape looks like. So you need to understand that the people, brands and retailers with proven sales that you respect and admire, what are they doing? What can you do that's not exactly the same as what they're doing but makes you competitive with them? So a question you'll get a lot from a retail buyer is, who's working with your brand? Where else do you have a presence? If it's online, offline, what does that look like? Are you working with influencers? Did you have product placement in something? That's all something that they'll want to talk about. So understand that working with social influencers is becoming more and more important. You can do it yourself and go through all the social channels and figure out where your audience is engaging, who they're listening to, what is actually influencing them. Or there are agencies like Trendsetter, fantastic agency out of New York, that can help you put your product in front of the right influencers and manages that for you. There's a difference between paid and organic placement. And there are a lot of FTC regulations around paid placement, so that's something you want to be aware of if you start working with influencers. Organic placement is something that an influencer genuinely likes your product. They want to talk about it because they're passionate about it. That's the best situation you want to be in, not have something that seems forced or hashtag ad, and it's something that somebody was paid to actually promote. It seems insincere. Social content development, that's something that you need to make sure that you're making buyers aware of before you engage with them as well, because they, again, want to know that you're generating demand for your products. So are you going to get your products in front of consumers, buyers, celebrity stylists, media? What are you actually doing to promote your product actively? Advertorial is a term that basically means if you buy an ad in a magazine, they'll also write an editorial story about you. So generally not something that's advertised, but as you enter into that world, you'll learn more about that. Editorial calendar development. So it's important that when you're developing social content for your products, that you have a good mix of kind of behind the scenes stuff, lifestyle shots, things that customers have shared, and call to action. So you don't just want to have the social content be sell, sell, sell. It seems pushy. You're going to lose followers. It's not something that people engage with in the same way that they feel like they're relating to something. So you have to be very careful about making it seem too salesy. So tools that you need when you go into a situation in which you're selling your products, you want to have a sales sheet, and you want to have at least some representation of this. If not the physical pieces, then something that shows a mock-up of something. So talk a little bit about your brand, and assume you're going to leave this behind. You might not be able to get the meeting with the buyer that you want. It may get passed on to somebody else, so this should be a pretty comprehensive package. Talk about your brand, what the labels look like, what the packaging looks like. If they're hang tags, anything like that that is showing your brand, that needs to be displayed in this as well. Any media coverage that you have, little clips, any kind of numbers about social engagement, that type of thing. And if you have established sales channels for your products, this is the right time to brag about that. So line sheets are something else that you want to have in kind of your arsenal of tools that you take in to meet with a buyer. A line sheet should have all of your styles, colors, and sizes available. It's important that the colors match. So if you haven't worked a lot with colors, if you look at a color that's printed out versus on a screen versus printed out and holding it in the sun versus artificial light, all the colors are going to look different in each of those things. So it's really important that you're communicating in something like a Pantone color number so people can understand what the actual color is. And that has to mesh potentially with a larger collection that the retailer's putting together, so you want to make sure that you're really accurate in your color. You want to include style numbers in there as well. So you also want to put a suggested retail price. It doesn't mean that's what they're going to sell it for, but that's your suggested retail price. And you also want to put what a wholesale price is. Now, that's going to be probably negotiated by that buyer, but it's good to have a starting point for that conversation. A word that you might hear when you're talking to buyers is keystoning. That's generally 100% markup and a 50% gross margin. Making sure that discounts are factored into costing. You don't want to start out too low, because if you look, for example, we were talking about Kohl's. If you look at the Kohl's model, everything's on sale all the time. So they're going to be changing that a lot, and you want to make sure that you're starting at a point where if discounts are applied, you're not killing your margins. So generally speaking, again, this is different for different industries, but you don't want to go below 35% gross margin. So if you don't have physical products, or you have too many physical products to wheel into a meeting with a buyer, have drawings, CADs, or photos, something that you can show to represent your line. Order forms are generally left behind. This applies more to boutique retailers, things like that. When you get into larger retailers, they're going to have automated systems. But it's important for you to understand what the terms are when you come into a meeting like this, so you can have an educated conversation with the buyer. So EOM is end of month. Net 30 means that the payment is due 30 days from the ship date. So if you're talking about 10 net 30, there's a lot of different terms that just, again, know what this is before you go into those meetings. What terms should you offer? Do a little bit of research on a retailer if you're not familiar with them, to make sure that they'll be able to pay you. That's the important part. So a little bit more about order forms. There can be discounts offered if someone pays cash. So that would be a retailer paying cash to you as the person who's providing the product. If there's a trade industry discount, if there's a quantity discount seasonal, again, this will mostly apply when you're talking about smaller retailers, boutique retailers. And make sure that when you're talking to the buyer, if there are changes to the PO that they've issued, that everything's in writing. What you don't want to do is go back and say, well, you said when we talked on this day, document everything. If you're having a conversation over the phone, send a follow-up email so you have everything in writing. Make sure you understand your transportation terms. So a little bit more about transportation terms. So FOB factory means that the buyer pays for the transportation. FOB destination means that the seller pays for the transportation and owns the product till it's received by the buyer. And this is really important for insurance purposes. FOB shipping point means that the seller pays transportation and owns until it's received by the shipping company. Again, all of these things are really important because who owns the product at what time makes it make more sense when you start talking about insurance and how long you have to insure those pieces until they arrive. FOB DCR means destination charges reversed. So that means the seller owns the goods, that you own the goods, until they're received by the buyer, and then the buyer pays for the transportation. And then we have DFP, which means destination freight paid. Again, it's important that you know these because you have to really know, not only for insurance purposes, but what your landed cost of goods are, and that should really determine your pricing. So you have to understand every nickel that you're investing in this process so you know whether or not your margins are appropriate. So a little bit more about working with buyers. Again, if you're going to show up in person, have a meeting with the buyer, make sure you have samples, make sure that when you're showing the line, everything, if it's a garment, that it's steamed, it's showing in a way that is in the best light for that product. Again, if you're working with boutiques, if you're working with a larger retailer, you have to have an appointment. You can't just pop in. But if you're doing pop-ins with smaller retailers, make sure you have a succinct elevator pitch and that you can get your point across quickly and make them want to talk to you further. You need to have some leave behinds because the person you are talking to may or may not be there. But if they are there, you have to be prepared to pitch. So make sure that you show up prepared, not saying, well, I thought I'd just stop by and I didn't know you were going to be here. Make sure that you're prepared to actually have that meeting. So in a virtual environment, some terms to know about and be able to talk to a buyer about, A+ content is really important. And what that means is that it's not just still images of a product. I'm sure you're used to seeing that on Amazon and different platforms. What you'll see more now, and you'll actually have retailers demanding this, is A+ content. You're trying to mimic an in-person experience. So you're showing on furniture a drawer being pulled out. If it's a soft close, you show the soft close. If it's a feature in a garment, you want to actually interact with that garment the way that a customer would if they had that piece in their hand. So anything that you can do, especially voiceovers to guide, make sure you just have some multimedia components to that and be able to talk about A+ content when you're meeting with the buyer. So if you're having a conversation with a larger retailer, they're probably going to expect you to have that, so be prepared. And that is something you'll probably have to pay for, but it's worth it because it actually translates into more sales if it's done appropriately. And you want to have digital versions of printed sales tools so that you can email, follow up with emails, and make sure that everything that you would have printed out if you were in a physical meeting can be sent in a digital way. So trade shows, I'm going to put an asterisk by this because trade shows aren't happening as they were right now, and they may never be the same again. So we just have to be flexible around this, but you have to understand your industry-specific show schedule because that generally determines a lot of the buying cycles, and you want to know that for your industry. So they may, a buyer may be holding on to their open to buy until a trade show happens because they're expecting to pick up new product at a trade show. So just know that things like that happen. Preparing for a virtual event, it's really important. I've attended in the last couple of months several virtual conferences. One of them was a lot like speed dating. So it was a 10-minute meeting, and then you have a 5-minute break, and then you go into a 10-minute meeting, and it's like that nonstop for 2 days. So you have to be able to, over and over and over again, have your elevator pitch ready and be willing to present that enthusiastically for 2 days, and then make sure that you're following up quickly with all of these people, because just as you met a ton of people, everyone else met a ton of people. So making sure that you follow up and reinforce the message during your initial conversation is very important. And again, be sure you're respectful of people's time. If you're doing some of these virtual events, show up at the meeting time. Don't be late. It's really important that you make the most of everyone's time and they don't feel like their time's being wasted. And again, follow up quickly. Connect with that person on LinkedIn. Send the digital assets. Just make sure you said, hi, thanks for your time, something like that. It's really important that quick follow-up happens, because you don't want to go back a month later. I don't know if you remember me, but we met at this thing. So it's really important that you do that quickly. So another thing to understand about trade shows is seasonality. So the seasonality of the consumer buying cycle is different than the buyer's buying cycle. So they're going to buy things far ahead, sometimes a year or year and a half before the consumer would actually have their hands on that. So it's important that you understand the buyer's buying schedule so that you can speak their language. And understand trend forecasting. That's what the buyers are looking at. So it could be things that are happening in the marketplace, just understanding the economics of the situation. Or it could be color-specific trends, industry trends. Just be aware of what's going on in your industry and be able to speak to that. Juried shows, if you hear that term, that means that there is a group of people that is assessing whether or not someone can participate in a show. You'll get that a lot in apparel shows in the fashion world. So rather than anybody just being able to buy a booth space, there's someone going through these products first and making sure that they're basically up to par for what's happening at that show. There are order writing shows and there are brand building shows. So know going into it if you can't go around demanding orders. If it's a brand building show, that's just not the environment to participate in that kind of behavior. So you want to make sure that if it's a brand building show, you have collateral to distribute. If it's an order writing show, be ready to take orders and talk about terms. Understand that there will be canceled orders. This happens a lot in the apparel world too. You'll have buyers, as they're going through the show, placing orders without the intention of actually following up on all of those orders. So they'll go back, they'll place a ton of orders and cancel maybe half of them, knowing that they only have X amount of open to buy, but they just take their favorites at the end of the trade show period and cancel the rest. So just because you get an order on your first day doesn't mean that a week later you're still going to have that order. And again, follow up, follow up, follow up. Make sure you're following up in a timely manner. So some resources for you. Here's a bit about Instagram shopping. Again, you can download this presentation so you don't have to jot all this down here. There are a couple of different sales and marketing tools. This is a great resource for if you're starting to engage in online sales. You can use one platform and sell through all of these different social channels. Doug Stevens, excellent person to follow. He does a podcast as well. He has 2 books coming out that'll be really interesting. They're coming out in spring of 2021, talking about re-engineering retail for the post-pandemic world and what retail is going to look like when this is all over. Retail Dive is another great website to pay attention to, talking about retail trends. And then we have the NRF, that is, they call themselves the voice of retail, and they really are, have their finger on the pulse of what's happening in the retail world. Business Insider and Fast Company, also good ones to pay attention to. So here's all my contact information. If you have any questions, want to chat about any of this, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, email me, call me. Happy to talk to you about any of this stuff. Now, go start something.